you guys, welcome to our first video regarding our topic for today, which is about cells. So we're going to do just a quick overview about the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes and what the cell theory is. This should be familiar to you, and your lecture professor should have talked about this in detail already. So I'm just kind of supplementing a little bit of information because it's going to be important for us as we virtually look at cells, right? So this first part will be about cells, and then the second video that you guys will watch later is about microscopes. So here we go. Hopefully you guys watched the TED Ed video about the cell theory. It's a very interesting watch about how this idea came about, because back in the day, they didn't really know cells existed. They thought that people were getting sick because of their social status. So we will talk more about this later once we talked about bacteria and whatever. But the idea back then was that if you were poor, that's why you're sick, because you're poor, which, long story short, makes sense, because if you're poor, you live in dirt and not so clean places, and if you are rich, then you're not so close to disease because you probably live in a slightly cleaner area than poor people are. But the invention of the microscope really helped people really find a new world in the microbes and then microscopic items. So if you watch the video, all of this should look familiar. If you didn't watch the video, I would watch that first. But this is the first microscope that was developed. So if you watch the video, you'll see how it's used. But it's kind of like a tiny, powerful magnifying glass. So it was able to magnify items, but not that crazy, right? So we will focus on two main people here, main scientists that contributed to the work of letting us know what cells are. That's going to be Anton van Leeuwenhoek, he was mentioned in the video, and Robert Hooke as well, right? So Anton van Leeuwenhoek, he's the one that made this type of microscope, and the first specimens that he observed, he called them animalcules because they look like little tiny animals, right? And then, a couple of years passed, Robert Hooke then made this type of microscope, which is probably what you think about and see when you think of a primitive, old school scientist looking microscope. This, the third one that you see, is what we are going to focus on. And some of you guys might have used this in high school or maybe even middle school. But again, we're going to talk about the microscope. Unfortunately, we're not going to have as much fun using it. So hopefully, at least once in your life, you've gotten to use a microscope. It's really, really cool. It's one of the things that I like about cell biology, is being able to look at small things like this. So we are going to use and talk about this microscope in the second video. But Robert Hooke was the one who gave us the word cell, right? Because he thought that it looked like little tiny rooms, kind of like a cell block. And he was thinking of that in terms of a monastery. For us, we might be thinking of a jail cell, right? But little tiny rooms that are very tightly compacted with each other. And so that's where we got the word cell from. So then all of those contributions that you've watched in the TED Ed video gave rise to something called the cell theory. And I'm going to mention this now because I don't think we talked about it in our previous lecture. But a theory is a scientific hypothesis that have been tested for numerous times for a long period of time, over and over and over again, and it gives you the same results every time, right? So that is a scientific theory, like this one right here. If you ever watch any crime shows with me, as my husband knows very well, you know how sometimes they're just like, oh, I have a theory that this is the culprit, and then I sit there and always vocally every single time say, it's not a theory, it is a hypothesis. But obviously they're talking about two different things, right? So in our case, we're talking about a scientific theory. So again, this is a hypothesis, a conclusion that has been tested numerous times over a long period of time. The cool thing about a theory is that it can change. So if one of these days we find something new about cells, then as long as it is tested numerous times over a long period of time, then you can add it to cell theory. Chemistry and physics have a lot of laws, right? Like the law of gravity, like gas laws, law of thermodynamics, those things do not change, right? A lot of those are mathematically proven and based, so it's all about the numbers. Whereas for a theory, it doesn't always have to be about the numbers, it could be about something else. So that's why you can always add on to a theory, whereas a law, you can't change the law, right? So here's the cell theory. There's 3 parts to it, and yes, you are gonna wanna, put a star next to this and go back to it, because even though it might not be too important in lab, it'll definitely be important in lecture, so you want to know the 3. And this is in no particular order, right? So first one says all living things are made up of cells, right? Second one, cells are the cells are the smallest basic unit of organization, and then all cells come from pre-existing cells, right? So the first 2 are very important when we are trying to determine if something is living or not, right? If we were doing this in person, I would have you guys go through a bunch of criteria as to what you think decides if something is living or not. But long story short, it comes down to the cells. If you don't have any cells, you are not living. So if for some reason we go out into space and we find something new, we have to figure out if it has cells or not. If it doesn't have cells, then it's probably not living, right? If it does have cells based on this theory right now, right, then it would be considered living. So the main, I would say main item for debate right now are viruses, right? So viruses, based off of this current theory, is not living. It is not considered a living organism because viruses are just protein and DNA. So the most common one that you guys probably see is the one that kind of looks like this alien spaceship looking thing, right? So the outside of the virus is a protein and the inside is DNA. That's it. It's not made out of cells, right? But like, again, if for some reason sometime down the road we find something about viruses that relates more to the cell theory, then we can add on to that theory, right? So that's one of the important things to note. The other important thing to note is this one right here, right? In lecture, you may or may not have talked about spontaneous generation, right? So back then, and this is again the wonderful thing about science, for a long time, people thought that cells just come out from nowhere. Like they just magically appear for some reason. That's spontaneous generation, right? But over time, as we have scientifically advanced, this name might look familiar, Louis Pasteur. And again, we'll talk about him later, but he's the one that helps us with the pasteurization of our milk, right? So he was the one who rejected the idea that cells just come out from nowhere, right? Later on, we will learn about mitosis and meiosis, which hopefully you have heard of before. Cells come from something. They don't just come out of nowhere, right? So nowadays, spontaneous generation is no longer true. And this is the new thing that we are talking about, right? So that is your overview of cell theory. And then we have 2 types. Again, I'm not going to go over a lot of it in detail. Most of it you might have gone over in lecture. But the 2 types are prokaryotic and eukaryotic, right? The prefix pro means before, right? So prokaryotic means this is a cell that is existing before complex life, right? And then how I remember eukaryotic, like you pointing at you. If we were on live video, I would be pointing at you, but you are a eukaryote, right? In high school, the main difference that your teacher probably taught you is the nucleus. So if you are a eukaryote, you should have a nucleus, right? Bacteria, prokaryotic cells do not have that, right? So if you take a look at the structure of the prokaryotic cells, they have these little swirly things, which is their DNA. They have these tiny little dots. I'm not going to circle all of them, but these tiny little dots are ribosomes, right? And then that's it. That's it. Whereas for a eukaryotic cell, you see all of these complex structures that you may or may not have gone over in lecture, right? But they exist. They exist. So here is a little bit more overview on prokaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cells, it says, make up the domain bacteria and the domain archaea. So bacteria you guys are familiar with because it's the bacteria that we know, like E. coli, Salmonella, stuff like that. That's bacteria. Archaea are a very special group of organisms that are very cool because they can exist in extreme conditions, like anything, right? Very hot, very cold, very acidic, very basic. They can live in those types of environments, whereas even us as complex cells, we can't do that, right? So it's pretty cool that they can do something like that. But here are key characteristics, and this is really all I need you to know about them. They're small. And it's kind of weird to say that they're small because everything that we're going to talk about when it comes to cells is small, right? Like relative to everything else. But they're between a eukaryote and a prokaryote are smaller than a eukaryote, right? So they're small. They have cell wall. I don't really need you to worry about what peptidoglycan is. It's fine. But that they have a cell wall, right? Their DNA is not surrounded by a membrane, right? So it's just floating around. And then they do not have membrane-bound organelles. So membrane-bound organelles like nucleus, right? Like mitochondria, right? Stuff like that. They do not have that, right? Whereas for eukaryotes, it's the opposite. They are relatively large, right? Some of them have cell walls. Only plant though. Right? Us, we are considered animal cells. Humans are considered animal cells. We do not have cell walls, right? DNA is surrounded by a membrane, so that's the nucleus part. And then they have different types of organelles. So again, that's all of it here, right? Mitochondria, smooth ER, rough ER, right? Nucleolus, we got peroxisome, centrioles, all of these things. These are all organelles and they're membrane bound, meaning that they have membrane around them. So those are the main differences between the two. Depending on the organism, you can have one cell, or you can have 2 cells, or a giant group of cells, right? So obviously, hopefully this makes sense, but unicellular, the prefix uni means one. Right? So unicellular means that it's just one type of cell. So for example, this guy right here, these ones are bacteria. And again, bacteria can come at one at a time. This one comes in pairs, right? So you can hopefully see that most of them have 2 attached to each other, right? There are some bacteria that can form something called a biofilm. So this one is talking about the plaque on your teeth, right? If you ever eat something sweet and maybe you don't brush your teeth before bed or something, you'll feel that like filmy feeling on your teeth. That's bacteria eating at the sugary treats that are left on your teeth, right? So they make a biofilm. That's how they can communicate with each other. And then we have something called protozoans, which is this green thing that you see right here, right? But they are unicellular. So this one is just one, right? Unicellular, right? They are still eukaryotes because if you just kind of zoom in and look at it, there's little tiny, they have these little tiny circles right here. They have like these green clusters right here. Like these are still organelles. It's just that they're one cell. For us, we are big organisms, so we're something called multicellular, which is on the next slide. So here we go. Multicellular. So again, hopefully that makes sense. The word multi means many, right? And so for us, and animals and bugs and plants, all of that, right? We are multicellular, which means we are made up of a lot of cells. For humans, I think we're made out of billions of cells. I don't even know if there's a number to it, but there's billions, right? And then hopefully this makes sense, or you remember this one from high school, but a group of cells make up a tissue, right? And the group tissues create an organ. Groups of organs give us organ systems, and then that gives us the entire human body, right? So all of the organs that we have, your stomach, your heart, your liver, your lungs, all of those are organs, and they are made up of tissues and ultimately made up of cells, right? And each of our cells in our body, most of them have what they need, like the nucleus, all of that stuff. There are a few exceptions to the rule, but we're not going to worry about that. You just got to know that we have them, right? But all multicellular cells are eukaryotic. And like I said, one of your learning goals is to be able to differentiate between both, right? So it is very possible on a quiz or on a midterm, I could ask you what the difference between a prokaryote and eukaryote is. So one more time, prokaryotes are bacteria, and then eukaryotes are plants and animals, right? So this is the things that they both have, right? So they both have plasma membrane. That is what is surrounding the cell, right? And just a little tip for you guys really quick. When you're memorizing this, think about it the opposite way, right? So it says both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have a plasma membrane. Cool, right? What's the other barrier called? Cell wall, right? So which ones don't or do have a cell wall? So think of it multiple different ways. Don't just get bogged down on one thing. Both of them have cytoplasm. It's kind of like a jello-like consistency that holds all of your organelles together. So like if you look at this cell right here, this kind of like faded yellow color, that's what it is, right? It's like they're floating in jello. That's what a cytoplasm is. They have genetic information in the form of DNA or RNA. Both of them have ribosomes. It's the tiny little red dots. So like these red dots right here, and see how these have red dots right here. Those are for protein making, right? And then proteins called enzymes are inside each of them. You can't see them in these diagrams, but they are present inside the cell. We'll talk about them in more depth a little bit later. And then here are just some pretty pictures of prokaryotic cells. Like I said, they all come in all shapes and sizes. So like these ones, these are circular bacteria. So they're called coccus is their singular form, cocci is their plural form, right? So anything circular is a cocci or a coccus bacteria. These bar-looking ones right here, right? The singular is bacillus and the plural is bacilli. So the most common one you guys might have heard of is lactobacillus. It's the one that is in your yogurt, right? Those are rod-shaped bacteria. So those are prokaryotic cells. And then here are your eukaryotic cells. We will briefly talk about some of these guys, but as you can tell from the pictures, they're a lot more complex than your prokaryotic cells, right? So lots and lots of cool techniques to visualize these guys. Whereas this one, I mean, it's either pink or purple or black and white, right? So really that's how it goes. But that's the end of this lecture right here. So go ahead and watch the next one. And we're going to focus more on the microscope and calculations on that topic. And just keep in mind what type of cells we're looking at as you guys go to the next one. So I'll see you guys in the next video.